In the autumn of 1941, as German Army Group Center advanced toward Moscow, a confluence of geography, ambition, and miscalculation laid the groundwork for one of the most brutal winter campaigns in modern history. The initial phase of Operation Barbarossa had exceeded many of the Wehrmacht's expectations. Vast Soviet territories had fallen, millions of Red Army soldiers had been captured, and logistics lines were stretching dangerously deep into the east. Yet the very speed of that advance, driven by the principles of blitzkrieg, became its own undoing. With roads turning to mud and supply, columns delayed by sheer distance and Soviet resistance, the German High Command failed to anticipate the scale and severity of the approaching winter. By late November 1941, German forces had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, held forward positions stretching from Kalinin in the north to Tula in the south. In theory, the Wehrmacht had more than 1 million troops allocated to the Central Axis, supported by roughly 1,700 tanks and 14,000 artillery pieces. However, these numbers masked deeper problems. Vehicles were suffering mechanical failures in the cold. Horses, still essential to German logistics, were dying en masse, and winter uniforms had not been distributed adequately. Opposite them, the Soviet Western Front, led by General Georgy Zhukov, had begun to receive reinforcements. By early December, Soviet estimates indicated more than 1.1 million troops were defending the approaches to Moscow, including fresh Siberian divisions redeployed from the east, following intelligence that Japan would not attack the USSR. These troops were better equipped for winter warfare and had high morale, bolstered by the defense of their capital. Geopolitically, the stakes of this confrontation were immense. For Germany, capturing Moscow represented not just a symbolic victory, but the potential collapse of Soviet central command and control. Hitler believed that Soviet morale would shatter if the capital fell, disrupting political and military coherence across the USSR. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, viewed the defense of Moscow as existential. The city was not only the administrative heart of the Soviet war effort, but also a critical railway hub and manufacturing center. Losing it would have fragmented command structures and disrupted war production. Internationally, Allied observers followed the events with cautious optimism. British and American strategists, though focused on their own theaters of war, recognized the significance of the Soviet stand. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had already extended Lend-Lease support to the USSR in October 1941, a signal of growing Western commitment to Soviet resistance. In preparation for winter, Soviet planners had taken steps, limited by time and resources, to construct fortified belts around the capital. Trench lines, tank traps, minefields, and anti-tank ditches were hastily dug by both military engineers and local civilians. Thousands of Moscow's residents volunteered or were mobilized to dig defenses under severe conditions, often with minimal tools. The German High Command, for its part, underestimated both the climate and Soviet tenacity. While meteorological reports from previous years had been available, Hitler and OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, assumed that the campaign would be completed before winter fully arrived. This miscalculation echoed similar strategic errors made by Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812, a parallel not lost on either side. German troops began to experience frostbite as early as late October, with some units reporting up to 10% of personnel incapacitated by cold-related injuries before major snowfall even began. Material shortages exacerbated the situation. German logistics officers reported critical delays in the delivery of cold weather gear. In some units, only 1 in 5 soldiers had insulated boots or winter coats. Lubricants and fuels froze, rifle bolts jammed, and medical supplies dwindled. These issues were particularly pronounced in panzer divisions, where mechanization was supposed to offer a tactical edge. Without heated shelters or mobile repair depots adapted for sub-zero operations, entire armored companies were rendered immobile. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, morale was paradoxically high despite the year's catastrophic losses. The defense of Moscow had become a rallying point. Stalin remained in the city, famously appearing at a Red Square parade on November 7th, where columns of Soviet troops marched directly to the front lines afterward. Radio broadcasts and newspaper reports emphasized the historical resonance of repelling invaders from the Russian heartland, invoking memories of Tsarist resistance against Napoleon and earlier European incursions. Intelligence operations also began to shape the battlefield. German aerial reconnaissance struggled in snowstorms and fog, while Soviet partisans behind enemy lines provided regular updates to commanders like Zhukov and Konev. Decrypted radio intercepts and captured documents gave both sides glimpses into opposing intentions, though often clouded by disinformation and battlefield confusion. By December 1941, the front had reached a fragile equilibrium. German divisions were stalled within 40 kilometers of central Moscow, their forward elements exposed in forests, open plains, and makeshift shelters. Soviet forces, reinforced and reorganized, were preparing a large-scale counteroffensive timed to exploit both the weather and German exhaustion. What followed would be one of the coldest, most punishing military campaigns ever fought. Temperatures plunged below 35 degrees C. Weapons failed, frostbite killed more men than bullets, and entire divisions became trapped in a white hell that neither army had truly prepared for. This was not just a military confrontation, it was a war against winter itself. As the calendar turned to December 5th, 1941, the standoff near Moscow reached a critical moment. German forces, stretched across a vast 1,000-kilometer front, began preparing for a final push toward the Soviet capital. The 4th Panzer Group under Erich Hoepner advanced from the north, while Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army pressed from the south. Yet the momentum that had propelled these armored formations across the steppes since June was now gone. With fuel shortages, immobilized equipment, and dwindling manpower, many battalions were operating at half strength or less. Snow fell in heavy sheets, reducing visibility to a few dozen meters and blurring the outlines of friend and foe alike. The opening phase of the Soviet counteroffensive began in the early morning hours of December 5th. Western Front Commander Georgy Zhukov launched a coordinated attack with multiple armies, the 5th, 16th, 30th, 43rd, 49th, and 50th, totaling nearly 1.1 million men. These included the newly arrived 258th and 259th Rifle Divisions, transferred from the Far East, whose soldiers were equipped with padded winter uniforms and trained for cold weather operations. Their movements were timed to hit German positions, weakened not only by exhaustion, but by terrain that rendered tanks and trucks largely ineffective. At Klin and Kalinin, north of Moscow, Soviet rifle units overran German forward positions, capturing supply depots and disrupting communication lines. Simultaneously, Red Army ski battalions, small mobile groups moving silently through the snow, conducted raids on isolated German outposts, eliminating artillery crews and capturing officers. These units, adapted to forested terrain and freezing temperatures, demonstrated a tactical flexibility the Germans lacked at that moment. The German 3rd and 4th Panzer armies were caught off guard. Despite intelligence suggesting a Soviet buildup, Hitler had refused multiple requests from his generals to withdraw to more defensible lines. His directive was clear: hold positions at all costs. This meant that many German formations, particularly infantry units like the 252nd and 87th Divisions, were forced to engage superior numbers with dwindling ammunition and virtually no air support. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated Soviet skies earlier in the campaign, was grounded. Aircraft engines froze on runways, and visibility was near zero for much of the first week of December. Without aerial reconnaissance or close air support, Wehrmacht commanders had little situational awareness. Soviet T-34 tanks, whose wide tracks and diesel engines gave them an edge in snow and ice, advanced where German Panzer III's and E-5's became immobilized or stalled due to frozen radiators. South of Moscow, near Tula, Guderian's forces were similarly pressured. The Soviet 10th and 50th armies launched their own offensive, supported by armored brigades equipped with KV-1 heavy tanks. These machines, though slower than German counterparts, were almost impervious to standard anti-tank rounds used by infantry. German soldiers described scenes of tanks crashing through frozen thickets, followed by waves of infantry emerging through the snowdrifts. Civilian involvement in this phase was significant. In towns and villages behind Soviet lines, residents were mobilized to assist with logistics, clearing snow, repairing railways, and transporting ammunition via sleds. In contrast, civilians trapped in German-occupied zones faced mass deportations, requisitions of food and livestock, and retaliatory executions for suspected partisan activities. The suffering in these areas escalated sharply as the front lines shifted and supply lines collapsed. German morale began to crack. Units like the 112th Infantry Division, stationed near Dmitrov, recorded over 30% casualties within days, not just from combat, but from exposure. Frostbite became a leading cause of evacuation, and the use of makeshift foot wraps in place of proper winter boots led to infections, amputations, and rising despair. Reports from field hospitals noted increasing psychological breakdowns among soldiers, many of whom had not slept properly for days, and now faced the certainty that Moscow was unreachable. Despite these setbacks, German resistance remained stiff in pockets. Elite units such as the Großdeutschland Regiment and elements of the SS Division, Das Reich, mounted counterattacks, holding key junctions temporarily. Yet even these forces were suffering losses they could not replace. The strategic goal of capturing Moscow, already postponed multiple times, was now effectively abandoned, even if not officially acknowledged by the OK. For the Red Army, the initial successes of the counteroffensive provided a psychological shift. The narrative of retreat and desperation was replaced with cautious optimism. However, Soviet commanders understood the risks. Every kilometer gained came at great cost. The 16th Army alone suffered over 2,000 casualties in the first 2 weeks of the counterattack. Fuel and artillery shortages remained, and command coordination across multiple fronts was uneven. Still, the initiative had changed hands. The German advance was halted. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, built over 6 months of near-continuous victories, was broken. The Eastern Front had entered a new phase, not one of sweeping offensives, but of grueling attrition, where ice, exhaustion, and frostbite would kill as effectively as bullets and bombs. The night that followed the Soviet push was not one of silence. Across forests and fields, flares illuminated snow-covered corpses, weapons frozen in dead hands, and the rising smoke of burning supply trucks, signals that the front had not merely stalled, but bled. As the front stabilized along a jagged arc northwest and south of Moscow, the leadership of both armies turned their focus to strategic reorientation. For the German High Command, the collapse of the offensive meant confronting realities that had long been ignored. Hitler's insistence on a static line of defense, codified in his December 18th Stand Fast order, left little room for maneuver. Divisions were forbidden to retreat, even when tactically necessary, forcing officers to choose between defiance of orders or the destruction of their units. Several corps commanders, including Erich Hübner and Heinz Guderian, pushed for flexible withdrawals to more defensible positions, but were overruled or dismissed. Logistical difficulties now dominated German planning. The supply system, already strained by the vastness of the Soviet Union, had effectively broken down in sub-zero conditions. Roads that were never fully paved became impassable with snowdrifts several meters high. Fuel was frozen solid in metal drums. Ammunition dumps, exposed and uncamouflaged, became targets for Soviet artillery. Wehrmacht quartermasters attempted to use captured Soviet railways, but differences in gauge and partisan sabotage undermined these efforts. Hundreds of trucks were abandoned or cannibalized for parts, and horses continued to die in the thousands, unable to survive on limited rations or withstand the temperatures. Soviet planning, on the other hand, entered a phase of calculated opportunism. Stalin, increasingly confident after the initial successes of December, authorized the Stavka, Soviet High Command, to plan broader offensives across multiple fronts. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko was instructed to open new attacks from the Bryansk and southwestern fronts, aimed at pushing the Germans away from Kursk and Kharkov. The aim was no longer merely to save Moscow, but to permanently shift the balance of power in the center and south. The Soviet use of interior lines gave them a distinct advantage. Moscow, with its central railway network and recently reinforced factories, served as a logistics and command hub. Reinforcements from the Urals, Central Asia, and the Far East continued to arrive. More importantly, the Red Army had begun to adapt its doctrine. Rather than rely solely on massive frontal assaults, Soviet generals integrated artillery coordination, armored exploitation, and flanking maneuvers into their operational concepts. Although not yet perfected, this adaptation marked a departure from the desperate human wave tactics of summer 1941. Propaganda played a strategic role as well. Soviet newspapers ran stories of heroism, often exaggerated or fabricated, featuring machine gunners holding trenches alone, or women operating anti-aircraft batteries. These narratives served both to inspire the population and to mask the enormous losses being sustained. German propaganda, in contrast, had to shift tone. Gone were the confident bulletins announcing Moscow in 10 days. Instead, the Wehrmacht's news services emphasized the hardships of winter and the bravery of troops defending Europe against Bolshevism. Yet morale among German soldiers continued to erode, particularly among conscripts and support units who lacked ideological commitment. In terms of military doctrine, the contrast between the two sides became more pronounced. The German focus remained centered on mobile warfare and tactical encirclements, yet the realities of the terrain rendered such tactics nearly impossible. Tanks, without proper winter camouflage or functioning engines, became static bunkers. In contrast, Soviet forces used terrain creatively. Ski battalions patrolled frozen rivers and forests, appearing behind enemy lines to disrupt communications. Light infantry with sled-mounted mortars conducted ambushes, while small groups of saboteurs targeted fuel depots and command posts. Intelligence and counterintelligence also shaped operational planning. Soviet military intelligence, GRU, and the NKVD operated a wide network of informants, including some German-speaking Soviet citizens who had remained behind enemy lines. These individuals provided information on troop movements, morale, and supply conditions. Captured German documents, retrieved from destroyed staff vehicles and abandoned headquarters, also gave insight into command structures and defensive plans. On the German side, radio intercept units, Funkaufklärung, continued to monitor Soviet communications, but the increased discipline of Red Army signal operators reduced the value of intercepted messages. One of the most critical areas of strategic planning involved managing replacements and medical care. German field hospitals, often set up in abandoned buildings with no heating or sanitation, were overwhelmed. Wounded soldiers froze to death on stretchers awaiting transport. Antibiotics were in short supply. Soviet field medicine, while also rudimentary, benefited from proximity to the capital and mobile evacuation trains. The use of female medics and stretcher bearers became more widespread, highlighting the total mobilization of Soviet society. At the high command level, Hitler began to reorganize his generals. Guderian was dismissed on December 26 after repeated clashes with the Führer over tactical withdrawals. General Strauss of the Ninth Army was relieved of command, and Field Marshal von Bock requested medical leave. In their place, more ideologically loyal officers, such as Walter Model, would rise in prominence. These shifts reflected not just military needs, but political calculations within the Nazi state. Meanwhile, Stalin centralized decision-making even further. The State Defense Committee, GKO, under his direct chairmanship, took full control of war production, food distribution, and internal security. Factories in Sverdlovsk and Chelyabinsk were instructed to increase tank and artillery output regardless of material shortages. Workers were subjected to 12-hour shifts and penalized for absenteeism. The entire Soviet war machine was recalibrated for prolonged conflict. Thus, by late December 1941, both sides had moved into a phase of strategic recalibration. The Wehrmacht sought to hold lines with diminishing resources and mounting political interference. The Red Army, battered but resurgent, prepared to carry its momentum beyond Moscow. The decisions made in these winter weeks would echo through the entire course of the war. And as the snows thickened and supply lines thinned, the Eastern Front ceased to be a battlefield of movement and became a killing ground shaped by endurance, improvisation, and ideology. With the strategic frameworks in place and revised operational orders disseminated, the fighting entered a new intensity. The Soviet counteroffensive, which began near Moscow, expanded into a series of overlapping offensives across the Kalinin, Western, and Bryansk fronts. The engagements that followed were chaotic, often taking place in dense forests, frozen marshes, and snow-covered fields where visibility and mobility were severely limited. Soviet infantry divisions advanced under cover of night and snowfall, sometimes with no artillery support, relying on the element of surprise and the exhaustion of German defenders. Northwest of the capital, the Kalinin Front's 31st Army launched a pincer movement around the town of Kalinin, now Tver, clashing with elements of the German 9th Army. German forces, already low on fuel and ammunition, attempted to hold positions in small fortified villages. The Soviets, employing ski troops and mobile rifle brigades, bypassed static defenses and cut off retreat routes. Within days, entire German battalions were encircled and subjected to concentrated artillery bombardment and close-quarters assaults. A pattern began to emerge. German forces withdrew, not as part of coordinated retreats, but under pressure and fragmentation, leaving pockets of troops stranded. East of Kaluga, the 50th Army made a rapid advance toward Yukhnov, outflanking German divisions, holding the southern approaches to Moscow. This move threatened the rear of Army Group Center and forced a hurried redeployment of reserve units from the 2nd Panzer Army. However, the redeployment was hampered by impassable roads. Columns of trucks and tanks became stuck in snow or broke down from engine failure. In many cases, equipment had to be abandoned and troops continued on foot. German casualties mounted not only from enemy action, but from hypothermia, malnutrition, and the physical strain of marching in freezing temperatures. A notable engagement unfolded near the town of Naro-Fominsk, west of Moscow. There, elements of the German 258th Infantry Division, reinforced by remnants of a panzer battalion, attempted to repel an assault by the Soviet 33rd Army. Over a period of 5 days, the town changed hands 3 times. Soviet artillery shelled German positions from concealed forest locations, while Red Army infantry used trenches dug into the frozen ground for incremental advances. The Germans fortified themselves in stone buildings and converted cellars into defensive redoubts. Eventually, Soviet engineers detonated explosive charges beneath key structures, forcing a German withdrawal under cover of darkness. Further south, the city of Tula remained a focal point. It had resisted the German offensive in November and now became a launch pad for Soviet advances. The 10th and 50th Armies conducted synchronized attacks aimed at breaking through German lines along the Shat River. The terrain, crisscrossed with ravines and iced-over streams, made coordinated movement difficult, yet Soviet troops persisted. Assault groups moved in tightly spaced formations to maintain cohesion in snowstorms. Flamethrower teams and sappers were used to clear bunkers and fortified barns used by German defenders. German attempts at organized counterattacks largely failed. At the tactical level, some battalion commanders improvised defensive belts using mines and booby traps. But without reliable artillery or air cover, these efforts could not stem the tide. In a notable instance near Rzhev, the SS Division Das Reich attempted a limited counteroffensive to relieve encircled comrades. However, their vehicles bogged down in deep snow, and Soviet snipers operating from treetop positions inflicted heavy losses. What should have been a 2-day relief operation turned into a week-long holding action that gained little ground and cost hundreds of lives. Civilian populations in the contested zones endured extreme conditions. In towns like Mozhaisk and Maloyaroslavets, the constant exchange of control meant evacuations, mass requisitions, and retaliatory violence. Civilians who remained were often pressed into digging fortifications, clearing roads, or nursing the wounded. In German-occupied villages, suspicion of aiding partisans resulted in collective punishment. Soviet authorities, in turn, detained suspected collaborators after retaking areas, adding a layer of fear to already traumatized communities. The fighting also revealed equipment disparities. German infantry units, many of which had lost their motor transport, operated with bolt-action rifles and machine guns that froze if not cleaned multiple times a day. Their mortars and light artillery, dragged manually through snow, offered limited support. In contrast, Soviet forces had begun to receive newer equipment: light mortars with sled mounts, winterized Maxim machine guns, and the T-60 light tank, which could cross frozen terrain with greater ease. While not superior in all respects, Soviet equipment proved more resilient to environmental conditions. Artillery barrages intensified as both sides adapted their strategies. The Red Army concentrated fire on known German supply points, command posts, and retreat routes. Batteries of 76mm field guns and Katyusha rocket launchers delivered saturation fire that disoriented and demoralized defenders. German artillery, including 105mm LEF-H howitzers and 150mm OSFH guns, responded with counter-battery fire, but their mobility and resupply were hindered by poor road access and enemy harassment. The dynamic became one of attrition. Who could sustain the bombardments longer? Who could feed the front with shells and fuel? By mid-December, several German divisions were effectively combat ineffective. The 35th Infantry Division, operating near Saikhevka, had fewer than 1,500 combat-capable men out of an original strength of 15,000. Entire companies were reduced to a handful of men. Similar conditions were reported in the 106th and 87th Infantry Divisions. German command posts issued increasingly desperate messages requesting reinforcements, supplies, or permission to retreat. In response, Berlin reiterated its order: no step back. The first engagements of the Soviet winter counteroffensive demonstrated a shift not only in momentum, but in capability. Red Army formations that had been shattered just months before were now maneuvering with discipline and purpose. Soviet commanders adapted quickly, reinforcing local successes and exploiting gaps. The Germans, for the first time, were responding to events rather than shaping them. The front was still fluid, but the direction of movement had reversed. The push toward Moscow was over. The German army now fought not to advance, but to survive. The initial shock of the Soviet counteroffensive gave way to a broader crisis for the German command. As Soviet forces pressed deeper into previously held German territory, the battlefield expanded and fractured. The German High Command attempted to stabilize the front by rushing in reserves from quieter sectors and reorganizing depleted formations into ad hoc battle groups. However, these efforts were consistently undermined by the same unyielding factors: brutal weather, logistical collapse, and mounting casualties. The crisis escalated along a 1,000-kilometer front, from Kalinin in the north to Oryol in the south, and the German military apparatus began to fray under the pressure. By the third week of December 1941, temperatures dropped below 40 degrees C across large swaths of the front. Steel weapon parts shattered under stress. Engines seized even when stored indoors. Soldiers were found frozen to death in their foxholes, rifles clenched in stiffened hands. The number of frostbite cases among German troops now rivaled those of combat wounds. Hospitals overflowed, and field medics had no access to adequate supplies. In many instances, soldiers resorted to stripping the dead of their clothing. Units stationed in the forests cut down entire groves in desperate attempts to build fires, further exposing their positions to enemy reconnaissance. In contrast, Soviet troops, though facing comparable environmental hardship, benefited from more methodical preparation. Padded winter gear, white camouflage capes, and fur-lined boots were more widely distributed. Soldiers constructed semi-subterranean dugouts, or zemlyankas, insulated with straw and wood, which retained heat more effectively than exposed tents. Red Army engineers developed improvised field stoves fueled by birch bark and animal fat, allowing food and drink to remain warm in sub-zero temperatures. The psychological difference was tangible. While German soldiers viewed the cold as a second enemy, Soviet troops were trained to endure it as part of the campaign. Meanwhile, Command and control on the German side began to deteriorate. Snow-choked roads cut off entire regiments for days at a time. Radio communications were often limited to brief, static-filled messages. Field officers lacked accurate intelligence, as reconnaissance flights were impossible during snowstorms. The Luftwaffe, grounded by weather and technical failures, could neither support ground operations nor maintain situational awareness. Soviet forces exploited this vacuum. Using scouts on skis and cavalry patrols familiar with the terrain, they probed for weaknesses and mapped German lines for exploitation. One critical area of breakdown was in the coordination between the different German army groups. Army Group Center, tasked with holding the line before Moscow, increasingly operated in isolation. Reinforcements promised by OKH were delayed or redirected. Supply columns from Army Group North were diverted to protect their own front near Leningrad. Communications with Army Group South, engaged in operations near Kharkov and Rostov, became sporadic. This fragmentation of command meant that Soviet breakthroughs could not be quickly countered with reserves or supporting firepower. The crisis deepened with the loss of several key rail junctions. Soviet forces captured important logistical hubs, such as Kaluga and Maloyaroslavets, which had served as transshipment points for German supplies. With railway lines severed and road convoys unable to navigate the snow, German troops in forward areas were effectively cut off. Ammunition rationing became standard. In some sectors, frontline units were allotted no more than 10 rounds per rifleman per day. Artillery units fired sporadically, reserving shells for confirmed Soviet assaults. Fuel shortages grounded vehicles, immobilizing armor that could have been redeployed for defense. Political tensions within the German command structure exacerbated the military crisis. Hitler's refusal to authorize tactical retreats created untenable situations. In the Vyazma sector, the 137th Infantry Division reported that its left flank had collapsed and that Soviet troops had penetrated 12 kilometers behind its lines. Requests to fall back to the Ressa River line were denied. The division remained in place and was subsequently enveloped. Over 8,000 men were either killed or captured. Similar encirclements occurred near Torzhok and Kolm, where lightly defended German positions were flanked by Soviet ski brigades operating without fixed front lines. On the Soviet side, High Command recognized the opportunity to inflict structural damage on the Wehrmacht. Orders from the Stavka instructed frontline commanders to prioritize cutting off and isolating enemy strongpoints rather than frontal assaults. This marked a strategic evolution. Soviet armies began forming encirclement groups, combined arms formations that used infantry to fix German units in place, while armored brigades and ski battalions maneuvered around them. These tactics were first tested successfully around Kalinin, and later applied on a larger scale near Mozhaisk. The political implications of the campaign became increasingly visible. In Berlin, the winter crisis was concealed from the public. Propaganda broadcasts spoke of defensive heroism and the spirit of the Eastern Front, while omitting casualty figures and territorial losses. Within the Wehrmacht, however, reports painted a grim picture. A December 23rd situation report from Army Group Center described the front as fluid, unstable, and exposed in all sectors. Morale among troops was reported to be critically low, with entire companies refusing offensive orders or abandoning positions without command approval. In the Soviet Union, the tone was triumphant. State media emphasized the liberation of Russian soil. The December victories were framed as the beginning of a broader push to reclaim the motherland. Speeches by Stalin and other Politburo members declared that the fascist invaders had been turned back for the first time. Recruitment drives surged. The defense of Moscow became a unifying narrative across the Soviet republics. While the material losses continued to mount, the ideological momentum was shifting in the Red Army's favor. Civilian suffering continued to intensify. Towns recaptured by the Soviets bore the marks of occupation: burned homes, mass graves, looted stores. NKVD units followed in the wake of advancing armies, detaining suspected collaborators and collecting testimonies from survivors. In German-held villages, partisans increased their activity, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing isolated patrols. German commanders responded with punitive actions. Public executions, forced labor details, and village burnings. The line between front and rear blurred, turning vast regions of the Soviet countryside into contested no-man's lands. By the end of December 1941, both sides faced the consequences of escalation. For the Soviets, success bred new demands, longer supply lines, exposed flanks, and the challenge of maintaining cohesion in overstretched units. For the Germans, the crisis had become systemic. Units were no longer being rotated, losses were no longer being replaced, and faith in high command was beginning to erode. The frozen battlefields outside Moscow were no longer sites of tactical maneuver, but zones of relentless attrition. Winter, once thought to be a temporary obstacle, had become the defining force of the campaign. As January 1942 began, the Soviet winter offensive reached its peak. The Red Army, buoyed by its initial successes in December, now pressed forward across the entire central sector of the Eastern Front. Soviet strategic objectives had evolved beyond merely defending Moscow. Stavka directives emphasized the complete expulsion of German forces from the Moscow region and the destruction of Army Group Center through deep penetrations and encirclements. In practice, this translated into a series of intense, overlapping offensives that tested the limits of Soviet endurance and German resistance. One of the largest operations during this phase unfolded in the Rzhev-Vyazma sector. Here, multiple Soviet armies launched simultaneous assaults aimed at collapsing the German front west of Moscow. The Western Front under Zhukov and the Kalinin Front under Konev coordinated their movements, aiming to envelop German forces holding a salient between Rzhov and Gzhatsk. The Soviets committed over 1.6 million men, supported by approximately 1,400 tanks and 2,000 artillery pieces. It was one of the most ambitious operations attempted to that point in the war. German positions, however, had stiffened. Despite the catastrophic conditions, Army Group Center had managed to regroup in key areas, establishing layered defenses in villages, forests, and frozen marshes. These positions were reinforced by units recalled from the rear, including parts of the 5th Panzer Division and elements of the 20th Motorized Infantry Division. Makeshift defensive lines, constructed from felled trees and frozen earth, provided cover against Soviet artillery. Machine gun nests, mortars, and minefields turned every approach route into a killing zone. The Soviet advance began with concentrated artillery bombardments. Entire sectors of the forest were leveled in attempts to break German fortifications. Infantry followed, often advancing through waist-deep snow. Tanks, slowed by ice and terrain, lagged behind or broke down en route. In places like Sikovka and Zubtsov, brutal house-to-house fighting unfolded as Soviet rifle divisions attempted to uproot German defenders. Soviet casualty rates soared. Divisions like the 415th and 220th Rifles suffered 50% losses within weeks, their gains measured in hundreds of meters. Despite these setbacks, Soviet breakthroughs occurred. South of Vyazma, the 33rd Army managed to penetrate 40 kilometers into German-held territory, threatening the junction between the 4th Army and the 4th Panzer Army. Simultaneously, the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, supported by ski battalions, advanced into the rear of German supply lines, targeting fuel depots and railway junctions. These fast-moving units caused significant disruption, forcing the Germans to divert forces from the front to contain them. The situation escalated further in the north. The Kalinin Front launched a major thrust toward Toropets and Velikiye Luki, aiming to isolate German forces operating in the Rzhev salient. Here, Soviet mechanized corps, including the 3rd and 4th Shock Armies, exploited thinly held German lines. Villages such as Andreapol and Okhvat fell quickly, and entire German regiments found themselves encircled. Those who could not retreat in time were forced to destroy equipment and attempt breakout operations on foot, often through waist-deep snow and temperatures nearing 45 degrees Celsius. Civilian suffering intensified alongside the military escalation. In contested areas like Vyazma and Gzhatsk, inhabitants endured artillery bombardments, food shortages, and reprisal killings. Many families were forced to live in underground cellars or makeshift dugouts, lacking fuel or medicine. German counterattacks in retaken villages often resulted in executions of alleged collaborators. Soviet partisan activity increased in these regions, emboldened by the Red Army's proximity, yet their sabotage missions frequently led to collective punishment by German units. On the German side, High Command struggled to manage the crisis. The OKH ordered the formation of Kampfgruppen, mixed units formed from the remnants of depleted divisions, tasked with holding critical crossroads and delaying Soviet advances. These battle groups, often composed of infantry, engineers, and a few armored vehicles, were flexible but chronically understrength. For example, Kampfgruppe Eberbach near Yukhnov held off repeated Soviet attacks for over a week before collapsing due to lack of reinforcement. Despite the deteriorating strategic position, the German lines did not collapse entirely. Several factors contributed to this. Firstly, terrain and weather limited Soviet mobility. Secondly, German engineering units constructed makeshift defensive belts that absorbed frontal assaults. Thirdly, German command structures, while strained, retained a degree of cohesion. Officers at corps and division level made tactical decisions autonomously, often defying Hitler's no-retreat orders when necessary. These localized decisions enabled key units to pull back, regroup, and re-establish defensive lines. A critical case was the defense of Gzhatsk, where elements of the 258th Infantry Division and 2nd Panzer Division conducted a controlled withdrawal under fire. Soviet forces, attempting to encircle them, were slowed by forested terrain and overextended supply lines. In response, the Germans used short-range artillery and Stuka dive bombers in rare moments of clear weather to slow the Soviet advance. Though the town was ultimately lost, the maneuver prevented encirclement and preserved several thousand troops for later operations. On the Soviet side, the peak of the offensive began to expose systemic weaknesses. Logistics could not keep up with the pace of advance. Fuel shortages left tank brigades immobile. Ammunition was rationed even as the offensive continued. Medical services were overwhelmed, with wounded soldiers often left for days without evacuation. Communications between frontline units and headquarters became sporadic, resulting in delays, confusion, and miscoordination. Perhaps most crucially, the Soviet command overextended its forces. Many rifle divisions were down to half strength, but continued to press forward without rest or reinforcement. The cohesion of shock armies began to falter under the weight of continuous engagement. Soviet commanders reported declining morale, increased desertion in some units, and logistical breakdowns in areas where depots could not be established. These conditions slowed the momentum of the offensive by late January. Nevertheless, the Soviet High Command remained committed to the pressure campaign. Orders were issued to expand the offensive into the Oral and Bryansk sectors, threatening Army Group Center from the south. The 61st and 3rd Armies advanced through forested terrain and frozen rivers, but their movements lacked the decisive coordination of earlier operations. German resistance stiffened as reinforcements, including Luftwaffe field divisions, were redirected to the area. The peak of the campaign reflected both the strength and the limits of winter warfare. The Soviet Union had demonstrated its ability to resist and counterattack under the most extreme conditions. Yet, it had not achieved a complete breakthrough or the destruction of Army Group Center. German lines bent, fractured, and reformed, but did not dissolve. The fighting reached levels of intensity previously unseen on the Eastern Front, with both armies sustaining massive losses. What had begun as a desperate defense of the Soviet capital had evolved into a complex, attritional campaign stretching hundreds of kilometers. The winter of 1941-42 revealed the brutality of modern war waged in a frozen environment. It pushed soldiers, commanders, and entire nations to the edge of collapse. And while the Red Army had seized the initiative, the full outcome of the Eastern Front remained unresolved. The battles of January had shown that winter could stop armies, but it could not end the war. As the winter dragged on into February 1942, both sides on the Eastern Front were forced to adjust not just their strategies but their very approach to survival. The campaign entered a phase of attritional struggle, marked by stagnating offensives, desperate defensive improvisations, and growing awareness on both sides that traditional doctrine could not apply in these conditions. What emerged was a brutal education in adaptation, a transformation in tactics, morale, and organization, as both the Wehrmacht and the Red Army sought to endure and, where possible, seize advantage in a landscape frozen by ice and saturated with blood. In many areas of the front, Soviet gains had pushed well beyond the support of their own logistics. Entire rifle divisions had marched and fought over 200 kilometers from their original staging areas. With rail transport unavailable and truck convoys struggling to navigate ice-choked roads, supply lines relied on horse-drawn sleighs, human porters, and hastily repaired narrow-gauge railways. Ammunition, rations, and fuel were delivered irregularly and in insufficient quantities. In sectors around Rzhev and Yukhnov, frontline units often went days without hot food, clean water, or medical supplies. Yet, despite these shortages, orders from Stavka insisted on continued offensive operations. Soviet soldiers began to adapt to the realities of prolonged winter combat. Dug-in positions were reinforced with logs, snow bricks, and earth-filled crates. Trenches were lined with straw and animal hides to insulate against frostbite. Patrols operated almost exclusively at night, using moonlight reflected off the snow to navigate enemy lines. In forests and ravines, ambush tactics became common. Scout detachments, usually 5 to 10 men on skis, would probe German positions, mark artillery targets, and retreat before drawing counterfire. Red Army commanders learned to rotate these units frequently to preserve stamina and limit exposure. The psychological strain of winter warfare was acute. For Soviet forces, ideological indoctrination, coupled with fear of the NKVD, enforced discipline. Commissars monitored units, distributing party-approved literature and conducting political education sessions in underground shelters. Soldiers were reminded constantly of the stakes. This was not merely a war for territory, but for national survival. Awards for valor were distributed more frequently, and frontline heroism was widely publicized to encourage morale. Nonetheless, desertions and self-inflicted wounds increased in several sectors, particularly among recently conscripted replacements. The German side also underwent dramatic transformations in operational behavior. With reinforcements delayed and attrition mounting, commanders at battalion and regiment levels resorted to flexible defensive groupings. Static front lines were replaced with a network of defensive strongpoints, villages, hills, and road junctions, held by small units with interlocking fields of fire. These units, often reduced to a few dozen men, were ordered to delay Soviet advances and hold as long as possible. They were seldom relieved. One example of adaptation occurred near Kolm, where the German 218th Infantry Division held a makeshift pocket surrounded on all sides by Soviet forces. With air resupply sporadic and overland relief impossible, the troops established an internal rotation. 2/3 of the force manned the perimeter, while 1/3 rested, melted snow for water, or attempted rudimentary medical care. They adapted their weaponry as well. Machine guns were wrapped in rags soaked in oil to prevent freezing, and bayonets were used as ice picks when digging defensive holes. Across Army Group Center, rear echelon units were redeployed to the front lines. Logistics personnel, Luftwaffe ground crews, and even administrative staff were issued rifles and hastily trained in trench warfare. Makeshift battle groups, many named after their commanding officers, e.g. Kampfgruppe von Sauken, Kampfgruppe Schmidt, emerged as flexible tools for crisis response. While lacking cohesion and heavy support, they could be moved rapidly to threatened sectors and used to stabilize defenses or counter small Soviet incursions. Improvisation extended to supply systems as well. In sectors where fuel deliveries ceased, German troops used captured Soviet horses to pull carts and artillery. In some areas, vehicles were converted into sleds using wooden runners. Artillery shells were cached in barrels and buried under hay to keep them from freezing. With no winter uniforms in many units, soldiers scavenged clothing from the dead, including from Soviet casualties. Field reports frequently mention German soldiers wearing mixed uniforms, including Soviet greatcoats and fur hats. Meanwhile, partisan warfare expanded behind German lines. Soviet partisans, increasingly coordinated by NKVD liaisons, operated in forests around Smolensk, Bryansk, and Vitebsk. They targeted supply trains, telegraph lines, and isolated outposts. Their operations disrupted German logistics and forced the redeployment of thousands of security troops. German countermeasures included punitive expeditions, scorched earth operations, and the establishment of fortified strongpoints along rail lines. Civilian populations were caught in the middle, frequently accused of aiding partisans and subjected to arrests, forced labor, or execution. Adaptation was also technological. Both sides experimented with winter-specific equipment. Soviet designers introduced the snare mine, a tripwire-based device easily camouflaged in snow. German engineers tested insulated shelters built from prefabricated panels, though few reached the front in time. The Red Army increased its use of snow camouflage on tanks and artillery, while the Wehrmacht began distributing snowshoes and insulated grease for weapon maintenance. In terms of morale, Soviet forces showed a growing resilience rooted in a sense of momentum. For the first time in the war, they had turned back the Wehrmacht. Although casualties were staggering, some divisions had lost over 70% of their original strength. The belief that the tide had turned provided psychological fortitude. In contrast, German morale suffered under the strain of immobilization, insufficient supplies, and tactical uncertainty. Reports from Army Group Center in early February noted widespread frostbite, psychological breakdowns, and a decline in combat discipline, particularly among newly arrived replacement troops. Yet, amidst the chaos, both armies demonstrated a grim determination to adapt and persist. The Red Army, learning from its catastrophic losses in 1941, was forging a more flexible, layered operational method. Its use of combined arms coordination, mobile detachments, and tactical deception marked a growing sophistication. The Wehrmacht, though on the defensive, continued to inflict high casualties, using terrain and improvisation to delay the Soviet advance. While both sides suffered immensely, neither collapsed. By mid-February 1942, the weather showed only marginal signs of improvement. Blizzards still swept the front, visibility remained poor, and night temperatures dropped below 30 degrees C. The war had entered a state of frozen stasis, where lines moved only slightly and at great cost. But the adaptations made during this period, born of necessity, desperation, and ingenuity, would shape the nature of the Eastern Front for months to come. The burning winter had forced both sides to evolve or perish, and neither, despite all losses, chose to yield. In late February and early March 1942, a turning point began to take shape. The momentum of the Soviet winter counteroffensive, so overwhelming in its first weeks, began to plateau. Harsh weather, overextended supply lines, and logistical exhaustion converged with stubborn German resistance to halt further major territorial gains. While the Red Army retained the initiative in several sectors, the window of deep penetration and large-scale encirclement had closed. The shifting balance did not reflect a German recovery, but rather a Soviet pause under the weight of its own advances. The frozen battlefield was now marked less by sweeping operations and more by grinding positional warfare. One of the most critical episodes in this phase occurred in the Demyansk salient. Here, two Soviet armies, Northwestern Front's 11th and 34th Armies, launched a concerted attempt to trap and eliminate a large contingent of German forces, including the two Army Corps, numbering around 95,000 troops. The Soviets successfully severed the land corridor in early February, encircling the German pocket near Demyansk. Soviet command anticipated a collapse within weeks. However, what followed instead was the establishment of a German air bridge, an audacious operation where the Luftwaffe flew in over 260 tons of supplies daily to keep the encircled troops operational. The Demyansk airlift marked a significant development. It was the first major attempt in military history to sustain an entire corps via air transport over an extended period. While not strategically sustainable in the long term, the success of the operation emboldened the German high command and shaped future decisions. most notably the fateful reliance on air supply later at Stalingrad. In the short term, the operation enabled the II Corps to hold out for 72 days until a relief force broke through in April. Elsewhere, Soviet efforts to surround and destroy isolated German units met with mixed results. In the Vyazma sector, Soviet forces had penetrated deep behind German lines, creating a salient over 200 kilometers wide. However, the very success of this advance became its vulnerability. As the 33rd Army and associated cavalry and airborne units pushed forward, they became encircled themselves by German counterattacks from both flanks. These formations, operating far from established Soviet lines and cut off from consistent supply, faced encirclement, starvation, and eventual destruction. In a notable episode, Soviet General Mikhail Yefremov, commander of the 33rd Army, refused evacuation when his forces became surrounded. He reportedly chose to die with his men, rather than abandon them. His death became symbolic of the tragic cost of overextension and the limits of operational momentum in the harsh winter environment. The destruction of the 33rd Army highlighted that initiative alone was not sufficient. Coordination, logistics, and sustainability were equally vital for strategic success. Despite these setbacks, Soviet gains during the winter remained significant. Dozens of towns and villages had been liberated. The threat to Moscow had been decisively repelled, but the offensive had not achieved its ultimate aim, the complete collapse of Army Group Center. German forces, while battered and depleted, maintained a coherent front. Reinforcements from other sectors, especially from quieter parts of the front in the south and the Balkans, were redirected to plug gaps and restore defensive depth. Luftwaffe transport units, despite heavy losses, maintained essential supply lines. Small-scale counterattacks were launched to straighten lines and recover forward observation points. The German recovery was also enabled by strategic shifts. Hitler reluctantly authorized limited withdrawals to more defensible positions in several sectors. This allowed for the consolidation of shattered units and the shortening of exposed salients. In sectors near Gzhatsk and Rzhev, previously isolated units were reconnected with the main force. The front began to stabilize, not because the Germans had regained superiority, but because the Red Army had reached the limit of its operational capacity for the season. Another important turning point was the growing role of Soviet High Command in moderating its own offensives. Stavka began issuing revised directives emphasizing consolidation of gains, reorganization of depleted units, and preparation for future operations once the weather improved. Front commanders were ordered to reduce unnecessary assaults, preserve manpower, and begin preparing defensive positions. While some commanders resisted these changes, the broader shift marked a maturation in Soviet strategic thinking, a recognition that unrelenting pressure without support risked reversing hard-won gains. Meanwhile, the human cost of the campaign mounted on both sides. German casualty reports from Army Group Center indicated over 33,000 killed, wounded, missing, or frostbitten between December 1941 and March 1942. Entire regiments ceased to exist. The Red Army's losses were even higher, with estimates exceeding 7,000 casualties in the same period, including tens of thousands lost in encirclements or cut off during overambitious thrusts. Soviet winter gear, while superior to the Germans, could not prevent the suffering from trench foot, respiratory infections, or malnutrition. Many soldiers on both sides succumbed not to bullets or shells, but to frostbite, exposure, and exhaustion. The impact on civilians was devastating. In the Smolensk, Kaluga, and Tula regions, towns changed hands multiple times, resulting in widespread destruction. Food reserves were exhausted, livestock had been requisitioned, and medical infrastructure lay in ruins. In liberated villages, Soviet authorities began the process of restoring control, re-establishing administration, conducting security sweeps, and distributing food when possible. In occupied areas, German reprisals for partisan activity intensified. Civilians were shot, deported, or forced into labor details. The front had become a zone of total war, where survival depended not on nationality or allegiance, but on proximity to violence. The psychological impact was equally significant. For Soviet civilians and soldiers, the successful defense of Moscow and the subsequent offensive became a source of immense national pride. Soviet propaganda seized the moment to craft a new narrative of resilience and resistance. For the German side, the myth of invincibility was shattered. Letters from the front, increasingly censored, revealed confusion and bitterness. Troops questioned strategic decisions, lamented equipment shortages, and warned that the campaign could not continue without change. The morale of many German units remained dangerously low, stabilized only by promises of rest, rotation, or eventual relief. By March's end, the front lines had crystallized into a new, frozen reality. The Soviet advance had stalled, the German retreat had stopped, but both sides now understood the scale of the war they were fighting. The night the Eastern Front froze in blood had passed, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. What had started as a bold push for Moscow had transformed into a brutal war of endurance, and for both armies, that war was far from over. As spring approached in April 1942, the Eastern Front began to undergo a transition, not only in weather, but in operational tempo and strategic outlook. The extreme cold that had defined the winter campaign gradually gave way to the thawing season, known in Russian as Rasputitsa, when snowmelt and rain turned roads into rivers of mud. This change did not bring relief, but instead introduced new complications: stalled vehicles, impassable terrain, and the spread of disease in flooded trenches. It marked the end of the Soviet winter offensive, not with a final battle, but with a slow and grinding halt. Both armies now turned their attention to recovery, reorganization, and, in many cases, retreat. For the Red Army, the culmination of the offensive required rapid shifts in logistics and deployment. Overstretched supply lines were realigned or abandoned. Armies that had advanced deep into German-held territory now found themselves dangerously isolated, surrounded by hostile terrain, exposed flanks, and German forces recovering strength. Soviet High Command ordered a strategic pause. Fronts were to regroup, dig in, and prepare for defensive operations in case of German counterattack. In many sectors, mobile brigades were pulled back to form a mobile reserve, while frontline troops began constructing elaborate field fortifications, bunkers, trench networks, and mine belts. One of the most critical Soviet challenges in this period was managing their exposed salients. The northern bulge near Demyansk, the deep thrusts near Vyazma and Gzhatsk, and the southern lines near Orel had pushed well ahead of supporting forces. While initially viewed as successes, these gains now presented liabilities. In particular, Soviet positions around the Ruzhev salient, held tenuously by exhausted troops, faced constant pressure from reorganized German divisions. Soviet commanders worried about encirclement, especially with the Rasputitsa slowing the movement of reinforcements and supplies. On the German side, the cessation of major Soviet offensives provided a brief window of opportunity to restore cohesion. Army Group Center, whose integrity had nearly collapsed in January, used the lull to withdraw to shorter, more defensible lines where possible, still under the constraints of Hitler's orders, which forbade any movement perceived as retreat. Where withdrawals were authorized, they were couched in terms of elastic defense or tactical repositioning. German engineers laid new trench systems, built concrete bunkers near key roadways, and planted dense minefields around forward outposts. Throughout April and May, German commanders worked to reconstitute shattered formations. Reinforcements, primarily from the Western and Balkan fronts, began arriving in small increments. Units such as the 18th Panzer Division and the Grossdeutschland Regiment were pulled back from frontline duty and rebuilt with new equipment, fresh troops, and refitted armor. Luftwaffe units also returned to the front, now equipped with new models like the FW-190 fighter and improved Ju-87 dive bombers. German logistical officers prioritized ammunition, fuel, and winter recovery supplies, slowly restoring some operational flexibility. However, despite these efforts, the Wehrmacht's situation remained precarious. Casualties from the winter remained unrecovered, especially among infantry units. Some divisions were at 40 to 50% of authorized strength. Psychological exhaustion was widespread. Reports from the Ninth Army noted that morale had not fully recovered, and that frontline troops were showing signs of lethargy, fatalism, and indifference to orders. Commanders implemented measures such as rest camps, increased rations, and propaganda drives to bolster spirits, but with limited success. German counteroffensives were attempted in limited form during this period. Near Yukhnov and Bryansk, small-scale thrusts aimed to recover lost ground or straighten vulnerable sectors of the front. These operations often met stiff Soviet resistance and produced only marginal gains. More significantly, these actions revealed that, while the Red Army was temporarily halted, it was far from defeated. Soviet artillery, now better organized and supplied, conducted frequent interdiction fire on German roadways and assembly points, preventing large-scale movements and disrupting logistics. Soviet partisans increased their operations during the thaw, taking advantage of the Germans' weakened control over rural areas. Forests flooded by meltwater became temporary sanctuaries for resistance groups. In the Smolensk and Kaluga regions, dozens of rail lines were sabotaged, causing weeks of delay in German resupply efforts. German reprisals were harsh. Entire villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and civilians were executed in reprisal. Yet, despite these measures, partisan activity remained a persistent and growing threat. The civilian population paid a steep price during this phase. In towns that had been contested through the winter, the devastation was near total. Buildings were destroyed, infrastructure non-existent, and food supplies exhausted. Soviet authorities attempted to restore basic governance in retaken areas, but the scale of destruction overwhelmed local administrations. In German-occupied zones, reprisals, forced labor, and deportations increased in intensity. Civilians were pressed into digging fortifications or clearing roads under threat of violence. Starvation and disease, particularly typhus and dysentery, spread through camps and shelters. One of the most harrowing developments was the humanitarian collapse in rear areas. Hospitals were overflowing with frostbite victims, amputees, and the chronically malnourished. Soviet trains attempted to evacuate the wounded and refugees, but derailed lines and air attacks frequently halted these efforts. German medical units, especially in the Demyansk pocket, had operated through the winter with minimal supplies. As thawing snow revealed mass graves and previously inaccessible corpses, both sides began the grim process of burying the dead, often in shallow pits or temporary cemeteries. Amid these conditions, the question of what came next loomed over both commands. For the Germans, the winter campaign had been a catastrophe avoided rather than averted. Yet, Hitler and the OKH now shifted focus toward the southern front, where the planned summer offensive, Case Blue, would attempt to capture the Caucasus oil fields and strike towards Stalingrad. Army Group Center was ordered to hold its positions with minimal resources, essentially transforming the Central Front into a static defensive line, while mobile forces were shifted southward. For the Soviet leadership, the campaign's end marked a moment of cautious reflection. While Moscow had been saved and vast swaths of territory liberated, the toll had been enormous. Many divisions would take months to rebuild. Stavka began planning a new wave of offensives for the summer, but there was growing awareness that success would require deeper coordination between fronts, better logistical support, and improved communications. Political officers were instructed to emphasize vigilance, warning of the likelihood of renewed German attacks. New partisan units were authorized. Rear area fortifications were expanded. The Red Army would not be caught off guard again. As the Eastern Front dried and hardened under the warming sun, both sides knew that the winter had only been one chapter in a far longer and bloodier war. The Soviet counteroffensive had checked the German advance, restored morale, and inflicted immense damage. But it had not broken the Wehrmacht. The Germans, despite their losses, remained a dangerous and disciplined adversary. The Red Army, though bloodied, had proven its capacity to resist and recover. The front was quieting, but only briefly. Across the ruined fields of Russia, the next phase of the war was already being prepared. The winter campaign of 1941-42 on the Eastern Front would come to be remembered not simply as a series of military maneuvers or weather-bound setbacks, but as a defining episode that reshaped the course of the Second World War. What began with the Wehrmacht poised at the gates of Moscow ended in strategic reversal, with both the German army and the Red Army bloodied, frozen, and transformed. The legacy of that brutal winter, known to Soviet veterans simply as the First Winter, would echo for decades in the doctrines, memories, and identities of both nations. From a military perspective, the campaign had forced a fundamental reassessment of planning and operations. For the German Wehrmacht, the myth of invincibility had been broken. The rapid advances of 1941, underpinned by blitzkrieg tactics, had collapsed in the face of environmental extremes, logistical overreach, and an opponent unwilling to break. The failure to capture Moscow, a city that held symbolic, logistical, and administrative value, meant that Operation Barbarossa could no longer be viewed as a short-term campaign. The war in the East would be long, attritional, and increasingly shaped by industrial capacity and mass mobilization. German commanders, many of whom had privately warned against the risks of advancing so deeply without winter preparation, emerged from the campaign more cautious and defensive. The experience led to significant changes. Winter clothing and supplies were prioritized for the next season. Defensive doctrines were revised, and mobile reserves were created to avoid being pinned in static positions. Yet these measures could not fully compensate for the material losses and psychological toll inflicted during the winter. The Eastern Front had transformed from a front of rapid conquest into one of grinding survival. The Luftwaffe, which had once dominated the skies over the Soviet Union, faced a sobering reality. The logistical challenge of sustaining air operations in extreme cold had exposed technical and structural limitations. The Demyansk airlift, while initially hailed as a success, planted dangerous optimism within the German command, setting a precedent for the ill-fated decision to supply the 6th Army at Stalingrad later that year. Meanwhile, the Red Air Force, though still weaker in aircraft quality, had begun to reconstitute itself. Soviet pilots gained crucial combat experience, and aircraft production ramped up, laying the groundwork for future parity. For the Red Army, the winter was both a trial by fire and a source of enduring confidence. Having endured catastrophic losses during the summer and autumn of 1941, the Soviet forces proved capable not only of defending Moscow, but of launching sustained counteroffensives. This shifted morale, doctrine, and leadership. Commanders such as Zhukov and Konev solidified their reputations. Operational planning became more methodical. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery, while still flawed, showed signs of growing maturity. The Red Army had demonstrated that it could stand against the most formidable land force in Europe. Politically, the Soviet Union leveraged the campaign to cement internal unity and international legitimacy. The survival of Moscow, symbolized by Stalin's decision to remain in the city, became central to wartime propaganda. Victory parades and speeches glorified the resilience of the Soviet people, the heroism of the Red Army, and the inevitability of final victory. On the international stage, Allied perceptions shifted. American and British leaders recognized the scale of the Soviet commitment and losses, prompting increased Lend-Lease support and a re-evaluation of the USSR's role in the global coalition against Nazi Germany. For civilians, the legacy of the winter was one of unimaginable suffering. Entire regions were depopulated, villages razed, and infrastructure obliterated. In liberated areas, Soviet authorities began compiling documentation of German war crimes, including mass executions and the use of forced labor. These records would later be used in post-war trials. In German-occupied zones, reprisals against partisans and suspected collaborators intensified. The front's civilian population had been caught in a vortex of violence, hunger, and forced allegiance, its trauma becoming a silent layer beneath military and political calculations. The human cost of the campaign was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that the Wehrmacht lost over 5,000 men to combat, cold, and illness during the winter of 1941-42. Army Group Center alone reported tens of thousands of frostbite casualties, with some divisions rendered combat ineffective. The Soviet toll was even higher, upwards of 800,000 casualties, including massive losses during overextended offensives and encirclements. Entire Soviet armies had been reduced to skeletal formations. For many units, replenishment came not from rest, but from immediate reinforcement with new conscripts, many barely trained. Beyond the immediate losses, the winter campaign forced both sides to institutionalize adaptation. The Red Army improved its winter warfare doctrine, supply coordination, and partisan integration. German forces increased investment in field fortifications, anti-partisan warfare, and operational reserves. Both armies learned to endure through logistics rather than maneuver alone, to anticipate environmental conditions as a strategic factor, and to prepare for total war. In the cultural memory of the Soviet Union, the winter of 1941-42 took on mythic status. It marked the beginning of what would be later called the Great Patriotic War's turning of the tide. In art, literature, and public commemoration, the defense of Moscow became a sacred narrative, proof of the people's strength and the righteousness of their cause. German military histories, by contrast, often viewed the campaign as a preventable disaster, a consequence of overconfidence, poor planning, and political interference. The failure to prepare for winter and the refusal to permit tactical withdrawals became emblematic of larger flaws in Hitler's strategic leadership. The physical landscape also bore the scars. Forests were burned, cities flattened, rivers clogged with debris and corpses. Trenches, bunkers, and battlefield detritus became permanent features of the terrain. Mass graves dotted the countryside, some marked, many not. In the post-war years, farmers would still uncover shells, helmets, and human remains as they plowed fields near Moscow, Vyazma, and Kalinin. Strategically, the campaign ended the prospect of a quick German victory in the east. The war would drag on for 3 more years, consuming millions more lives. The failure to capture Moscow in 1941 meant that Germany would fight a 2-front war it could not win. For the Soviet Union, survival had come at a massive cost, but also with an opportunity to recover, rearm, and eventually counterattack on a scale never before imagined. In the end, the winter of 1941-42 froze not only armies, but illusions. It stripped both sides of certainty and forced a reckoning with the true nature of the war they were waging. It was no longer a war of swift campaigns or ideological crusades. It was a war of annihilation, attrition, and endurance. And in the forests, fields, and ruins of the Eastern Front, the ground remained soaked not only with melted snow, but with the blood of 1 million soldiers and civilians who struggled to find the fate of a continent.